In the spring of 1845, Sir John Franklin was chosen to lead what many believed would be the final conquest of the fabled Northwest Passage. Franklin was a well-known hero of the Royal Navy and an experienced Arctic explorer, but in recent years he was gaining the image of an aging statesman. Two ships were selected for the journey, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Both were fitted with the finest technology of the Victorian age: steam engines, iron plating, 3 years of provisions, and libraries stocked with more than 1,000 books. It was the pinnacle of imperial ambition: science, exploration, and empire bound together in oak and iron. They set sail from Greenhithe, England on May 19th, and would later stop in Greenland 6 weeks later to send home sick crew members. Also sent back to England during their stop in Greenland were stacks of letters from Franklin and his crew to their families back home. What happened to the crew and their ships after this point remained a mystery for over a century. Their last confirmed sighting came from 2 whaling ships in Baffin Bay just weeks after departing Greenland. But after that, nothing. No letters, no dispatches, no wreckage, only an endless pack of ice. It was later discovered that by September of that same year, both ships had vanished into the Arctic wilderness, imprisoned by shifting floes near King William Island. For 2 long winters, they remained frozen in place. And then one day, the men, what remained of them that is, stepped off the ships and onto the ice. They left behind the safety of their hulls and walked into oblivion. Europe knew nothing of this at the time, but in the snowbound silence of the North, the Inuit remembered stories of starving white men dragging boats across the tundra, stories of death, desperation, and something darker. This is the story of Sir John Franklin's lost expedition.
In the Victorian England, they wanted the idea that they all marched together as a valiant band across desolate wastes and met a heroic end. And I can't say that they weren't heroic just because of the way they died, but I don't think that that's the way it happened.
These individuals were being intentionally dismembered, perhaps for consumption. I think the evidence strongly suggests cannibalism.
It's really a frightful place to die.
When Sir John Franklin's ship slipped into the ice-choked waters of the Canadian Arctic in 1845, they entered a region claimed by Britain, but scarcely understood by Europeans or the colonists meant to inherit it. Canada, as the nation we know today, did not yet exist. What lay in its place was the young province of Canada, newly forged from the Act of Union just 4 years earlier, an uneasy merger of Upper and Lower Canada, still recovering from rebellion. The North, meanwhile, was claimed by the British Crown, but was largely left to the Hudson's Bay Company to colonize and extract its resources. Even still, their reach rarely touched the distant Arctic coast. Yet the Arctic had long been a world complete unto itself, a stark, sovereign landscape of permafrost and stone, ruled by ice and silence. Winters dipped well below -40 degrees Celsius, and the long nights stretched endlessly across snowbound plains and frozen sea. In summer, the sun hung low but unrelenting, exposing a tundra too thin to farm, too hard to break. Rivers like the Mackenzie ran wide and deep in the west, but were still rarely navigated by Europeans. Interestingly, Franklin actually took part in an expedition of the Mackenzie River a few years prior to his disappearance, but we'll discuss that more in the next section. Construction up north was futile, roads were few, and the very ground could shift beneath your feet. It was and remains a land of extremes: subarctic, glacial, luminous.
No roads lead to the outside world. Beyond the outskirts of town lie thousands of square miles of desolation, the barren land of the hostile North. To the east, a frigid sea. In October, the winds of winter sweep down from out of the north. So fierce are these gales that only limbs on the lee side of the stunted trees survive.
But to the Inuit, it was home. Their ancestors had crossed from Siberia and Alaska centuries before, mastering this land in ways few outsiders could ever grasp. They followed caribou trails across wind-scoured plains, hunted seals beneath breathing holes in the ice, and built igloos that warmed like hearths in the heart of winter. Their knowledge was layered in language and passed through story, refined across generations. They knew how to read snow as one might read stars. Their world was not static but alive, with rhythm, resource, and resilience. When Franklin and his crew vanished into that vast silence, it was the Inuit who saw the shadows he left behind. Sir John Franklin was born on the 16th of April, 1786, in the quiet market town of Spilsby, Lincolnshire, the 9th of 12 children in a family that straddled the line between modest means and upward ambition. His father, Willingham Franklin, a merchant with roots in the country nobility, had loftier visions for his son, perhaps the clergy, or the measured security of business. But the sea called louder to the young Franklin. At just 12, he was allowed a trial voyage aboard a merchant ship, and he was hooked. The salt and wind stayed in his blood for the rest of his life. By March 1800, his father reluctantly secured him a place in the Royal Navy. Franklin joined HMS Polyphemus, a 64-gun ship under the command of Captain Lawford. He was still a boy when he found himself at the Battle of Copenhagen in 1801, watching Horatio Nelson defy orders with a spyglass held to his blind eye. Glory came early, but not without blood. He served under Matthew Flinders aboard HMS Investigator, helping to chart the unexplored coast of Australia. In 1804, he saw action again at the Battle of Pulo Ora, helping repel a French squadron in the South China Sea. And in 1805, he was present aboard HMS Bellerophon at Trafalgar, where Britain broke Napoleon's naval power and left Franklin with a deepening sense of empire, duty, and sacrifice. His naval career carried him through the War of 1812, where he was wounded in the brutal fighting at Lake Bourne. In 1818, he commanded HMS Trent on an expedition toward the Arctic under Captain David Buchan. The ice rebuffed them, but the North had gripped Franklin's imagination. He would return, this time on foot. In 1819, the Admiralty appointed Franklin to lead an overland expedition to chart the Arctic coast eastward from the Coppermine River. The goal was audacious: trace the unmapped edge of the continent and help complete the Northwest Passage. With Franklin were men who would become storied in their own right, like John Richardson or George Back. But the mission was marred from the start. Supplies were few, their relationships with fur traders and indigenous allies frayed, and starvation started to loom over them. Franklin would narrowly escape death again when he nearly drowned in the Hayes River. Of the 22 men who began the trek, 11 died, some by exposure, others by murder, and possibly cannibalism. In the end, they ate their own leather boots to survive. The Yellow Knives Nation rescued the survivors, who had been presumed dead. And yet, when Franklin returned to England in 1822, he was hailed as a hero. The horror was rebranded as Perseverance, with newspapers christening him the man who ate his boots. Undeterred, Franklin led a second expedition in 1825, this time down the previously mentioned Mackenzie River, turning west along the Arctic coast. Older, wiser, and far better supplied, Franklin oversaw a more successful journey. He mapped over 1,200 miles of coastline and earned a reputation not for flair, but for steady competence. An officer of the old school, dutiful and tireless. In 1837, he was appointed Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land, modern-day Tasmania. It was a reward for his service to the crown, but also a test of character. He arrived with noble intentions: reform the penal system, expand education, and promote science and culture. His wife, Lady Jane Franklin, was a force in her own right, founding gardens, sculpture galleries, and even adopting an indigenous girl named Mathina. But Franklin's progressive ideals ran aground on the rocky shores of colonial politics. By 1843, his enemies in the local elite had him recalled. His legacy lingered in place names and institutions, but Franklin returned to England politically bruised and personally adrift. By this point, he was 59, aging, overweight, and being passed over for more vigorous men. But when the Admiralty prepared one final push to conquer the Northwest Passage, Franklin lobbied with quiet desperation. Others had youth. Franklin had connections, reputation, and a lifetime spent chasing the margins of empire. In 1845, Sir John Franklin was named commander of 2 ships which were being refitted into the most advanced polar ships of their time. The mission was meant to be a crowning triumph, a scientific endeavor, a final conquest, a last great chapter. It would instead vanish into silence and leave behind only ice, whispers, and the long shadow of tragedy. The ships selected for Sir John Franklin's 1845 expedition were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, battle-hardened vessels with a dark elegance and a hard-earned legacy. Both had once hurled mortars in war, and both had braved the far reaches of the Antarctic under James Clark Ross just a few years prior. Their names, drawn from Greek mythology and fear itself, now sailed not into battle, but into the unknown silence of the Arctic. Before departure, the 2 ships underwent extensive refits for polar survival. Iron plating was added to their hulls, their decks cross-braced with oak beams, their bows armored to endure the crushing force of Arctic ice. From the railway yards came steam engines, 25 horsepower locomotives repurposed to power screw propellers that could be raised into protective wells. Though the engines offered only 4 knots at best, it was enough to push through slack ice or dead calms. Each ship carried 12 days' coal and even featured an experimental heating system to warm the crew quarters, small mercies against the frigid polar night. Command of the expedition had not come easily. In early 1845, Sir John Barrow, aged and near retirement, believed the Northwest Passage to be within reach. He first turned to his Arctic champions, Parry, Ross, Back, all of whom declined. James Fitzjames was rejected for being too young, and Francis Crozier declined out of modesty, knowing there were more experienced explorers available. And so, somewhat reluctantly, Barrow appointed Sir John Franklin, 59 years old, a seasoned explorer, but a man some considered past his prime. Still, his name carried weight. Franklin would command Erebus. Fitzjames, now his second in command, would serve as its captain. Terror was entrusted to Francis Crozier, experienced, able, and quietly burdened with the knowledge that should Franklin fall, the expedition might rest on his shoulders alone. Together, the ships carried 129 men, officers, sailors, marines, engineers. Most were British, hailing from northern England, Scotland, and Ireland. 2 were born abroad, Charles Johnson of Nova Scotia and Henry Lloyd of Norway. Only a select few had tasted Arctic hardship. Franklin, Crozier, Fitzjames, Lieutenant Graham Gore, Assistant Surgeon Alexander MacDonald, and the 2 ice masters, James Reed and Thomas Blanky. The provisions were vast, packed into every crevice and cavity of the ships. Over 8,000 tins of preserved food had been hastily supplied under contract by Stephen Goldner, rushed through in just 7 weeks, sealed with thick lead solder that oozed like candle wax. Alongside them were barrels of salted meat, pemmican, hardtack, and tinned vegetables. Each vessel carried over 1,000 books, treatises, novels, encyclopedias, and the makings of genteel life: mustard, tobacco, lemon juice, musical instruments, and enough liquor to dull both body and spirit. It was vital for these ships to be fully stocked to last the expected 3 years they'd be at sea. And then, with ceremony and hope, Erebus and Terror slipped away from the docks in Greenhithe on May 19, 1845, and began making their way down the Thames. They carried the tools of empire, the dreams of science, and the hearts of 129 men into waters that would never bring them back. Erebus and Terror stopped at Stromness in the Orkney Islands to replenish their water stores, then pressed on to Greenland, accompanied partway by HMS Rattler and the Barretto Jr. After a 6-week Atlantic crossing, they reached the Whalefish Islands in Disco Bay by late June. There, 10 oxen brought for fresh meat were slaughtered and distributed to the ships. Before leaving, the men would also write their final letters home. Franklin wrote to Lady Franklin. The crew wrote letters to their loved ones, some noting Franklin's ban on swearing and drinking, and 5 sick crewmen were sent home. The expedition's final strength stood at 129 men. Their last known contact came in late July, when the whaling ships Prince of Wales and Enterprise encountered Erebus and Terror in Baffin Bay. The ice had not yet loosened in Lancaster Sound, so the ships waited. Then they sailed on into the Arctic and into silence. The expedition wintered at Beechey Island in 1845-46, where 3 men died and were buried. By the following summer, the ships navigated south through Peel Sound, but in September 1846, they became locked in the ice off the northwest coast of King William Island. They never sailed again. For the next year and a half, Erebus and Terror remained trapped. Then came the pivotal document, discovered years later in a cairn near Victory Point, bearing 2 separate entries. The first, dated May 1847, seemed routine, noting the expedition's position and that all was well. But the second entry, scrawled nearly a year later, on April 25, 1848, revealed the true crisis. Franklin had died on June 11, 1847. 9 officers and 15 men were dead. The ships had endured 2 brutal winters in the ice. Supplies were fading. The men were succumbing to scurvy, possibly tuberculosis. Their only hope at survival was to walk. On April 26, 1848, 105 survivors, led by Captain Francis Crozier and Commander James Fitzjames, abandoned the ships and began hauling boats and provisions across King William Island. Their goal, the Back River, 400 kilometers away on the Canadian mainland, but the landscape in between offered no mercy. They faced shattered sea ice, freezing winds, and hunger that gnawed at muscle and mind alike. This was the final confirmed act of the Franklin expedition. Beyond it, only shadows. A lifeboat found years later held 2 frozen corpses and scattered gear. Skeletons were also discovered along the route south. Inuit testimony spoke of starving white men dragging sledges. Some said they turned to cannibalism. Others whispered that a few, including Crozier, may have reached the mainland. Back in England, the silence surrounding the expedition grew heavier with each passing year. For nearly 30 years, Lady Jane Franklin refused to accept it. Relentless in her determination, she poured her energy, influence, and wealth into the search, personally sponsoring 7 expeditions and backing many more. In 1859, the ship Fox, led by Francis Leopold McClintock, returned with heartbreaking proof, the Victory Point record and relics confirming Sir John Franklin's death. but Lady Franklin could not bring herself to accept the darker reports. She fiercely rejected John Ray's 1854 claims of cannibalism and continued to hope that written records, perhaps the full story, remained hidden in the frozen north. Even as she neared the end of her life in the 1870s, she was still searching for answers. In 1854, John Ray met an Inuk who spoke of 35 to 40 white men dying of starvation near the Back River. Ray was given silverware from Franklin's officers and heard reports of cannibalism, details that horrified Britain and led to a smear campaign by Lady Franklin and Charles Dickens. Other Inuit recalled visiting one of the ships near King William Island, seeing men aboard Erebus before it sank, and later finding corpses and abandoned gear. Explorer Charles Francis Hall, working closely with Inuit guides from 1861 to 1869, collected hundreds of pages of oral history, tales of hunts shared with survivors, of watches taken from the dead, and of a shallow grave on King Edward Island. These were the last facts as the 19th century knew them. No journal survived the cold, no man returned to tell the story. All that endured were relics in the snow, fading footprints on the ice, and the enduring silence of the Arctic. In the summer of 1981, a quiet but determined revival began. Led by anthropologist Dr. Owen Beattie, a team from the University of Alberta launched the Franklin Expedition Forensic Anthropology Project. Their goal, use modern science to uncover what had killed Franklin's men. That summer, they traced the expedition's path along King William Island's windswept western shore, recovering scattered bones and forgotten relics. Forensic analysis revealed signs of scurvy and tuberculosis. Bones showed alarmingly high levels of lead, nearly 10 times higher than Inuit control samples. Poorly soldered tins were blamed, but others suspected the ship's unique desalination systems. The bones also bore cut marks, evidence, now physical and undeniable, of cannibalism among the final survivors. In 1984, Beattie's team exhumed 3 graves on Beechey Island. The corpses, astonishingly well preserved in permafrost, underwent autopsy in Arctic field tents. John Torrington's tissues confirmed severe lead poisoning and pneumonia. There were also discarded tin cans nearby with visibly failed seams, hinting at contamination.
Next to the grave site, this has to be the most important part of this particular location. And we think the reason is that the graves and the bodies in the graves and what they're going to tell us connects directly to this site. This is a can dump left here by Franklin. Our theory is, and I think we can confirm it here today, if we look at any of these cans here, we can pick up and see a problem. Here's a beautiful example of a can with inside big lumps of lead tin solder in direct contact with the food. And if you pick up pretty well any piece here, you'll see inside the can a large quantity of solder. And this would have contaminated the food over a period of time while they were stored on the ships, and maybe even when they're reheating of the food in the cans. And I think there's no question here that these cans are an extremely important part of the story.
The findings gripped the world. Media coverage surged after photographs of Torrington's frozen face appeared in international headlines, reigniting global fascination with Franklin's fate. The 1990s brought further depth and deeper unease. In 1992, scholar Barry Ranford and his team uncovered a haunting cache of skeletal remains and artifacts at a site matching McClintock's 1859 boat place. Excavations in 1993, led by forensic anthropologist Anne Keenlyside, recovered nearly 400 bone fragments. Personal items such as buttons, clay pipes, and brass fittings lay among them. Analysis showed extensive cut marks, some consistent with the extraction of marrow. Later studies would confirm what was once unspeakable: bones broken, polished by boiling, bearing signs of starvation-induced cannibalism. The dead had become the last ration of the dying.
These individuals were being intentionally dismembered, perhaps for consumption. I think the evidence strongly suggests cannibalism. If I can show you a few examples, here we've got a rib fragment with 4 cut marks here, here, little one here, and there. Very distinct. We've also got them on some of the vertebrae. This is an atlas vertebra, the first vertebra in the neck, and there's a very distinct cut mark there.
Meanwhile, historian David Woodman turned to Inuit oral history. Between 1994 and 1997, he led or coordinated multiple expeditions over land, ice, and sea, searching for lost burial sites and unexplored coastlines. Most searches returned little more than rusted cans or weathered fragments, but they reinforced Inuit accounts that had long pointed toward the southeast shores of King William Island.
David Woodman is searching King William Island for his own clues. He's convinced Franklin could have survived if he'd only adapted. Woodman's written a book compiling for the first time all the Inuit testimony about Franklin, testimony the British Navy rejected.
Why would they not have paid attention to the Inuit testimony before, do you think?
In the Victorian England, they wanted the idea that they all marched together as a valiant band across desolate wastes and met a heroic end. And I can't say that they weren't heroic just because of the way they died, but I don't think that that's the way it happened. If you don't want to hear what somebody's telling you and you don't really trust them anyway for whatever bias you have, it just gets shunted away.
In 1994, Elder Frank Analoch told author Dorothy Harley Eber a story passed down through generations of a ship wintering near Imangialuk Island and men camping on shore, sick, hungry, and dwindling in number. These testimonies, consistent and geographically detailed, joined a growing body of oral tradition that Western researchers had begun to re-examine with renewed seriousness. By 2008, these narratives directly shaped the next phase of the search. Parks Canada, under Robert Greenhithe, partnered with Inuk historian Louis Kamukak, whose vast geographical knowledge and cultural insight became the expedition's compass. In 2009, the grave on King Edward Island that Charles Francis Hall learned about from the local Inuit community was identified as Assistant Surgeon Harry Goodseer. By the early 2000s, the search entered a new phase. Woodman's team deployed sled-drawn magnetometers across the sea ice, methodically scanning areas near Kirkwall and O'Reilly Islands. These surveys found only natural anomalies, but helped eliminate false leads and refine the search grid. Parks Canada soon took up the effort, launching expeditions with sonar-equipped boats. Their 2008 mission leaned heavily on oral testimony collected by historian Dorothy Harley Eber and guided by Inuk historian Louis Kamukak, whose knowledge of the land was instrumental in shaping the search. Then came the breakthrough.
Well, we're looking at the first sonar contact that we've imaged since starting surveying here in 2008. We surveyed one line in this new interesting survey area. So this is the second line in this new area, and we had just started southbound on the second line. It passed right over top of this wreck structure, which just on I think we could tell exactly what it was in a few seconds. It's definitely a shipwreck, and we're going to learn a lot more about it.
So that was about, what, 5-10 minutes ago?
I would say so.
What was the reaction like? Scientific detachment, or?
I would like it to winning the Stanley Cup.
On September 7th, 2014, during the Victoria Strait expedition, sonar images lit up the bottom of Wilmot and Crampton Bay, a remarkably intact wreck resting in just 11 meters of water. Even the deck planking was still visible. A few weeks later, Prime Minister Stephen Harper confirmed in Parliament what many had hoped to hear for over a century. HMS Erebus had been found.
I just want to say this about something that was said in the introduction. I have to tell you that the truth is, when I got the word, the phone call came in, that they found the Erebus, my immediate reaction was one of surprise. So, you know you're a politician when you can confidently predict something, but then be surprised when it happens.
2 years later, its twin emerged. In 2016, the Arctic Research Foundation discovered HMS Terror in Terror Bay. This ship sat deeper, 24 meters down, but eerily preserved. Window panes remained unbroken, drawers were closed, teacups sat in their cupboards. Unlike Erebus, which had taken damage from shallow swells, Terror appeared to have settled slowly, untouched. The Inuit testimony, once dismissed, had been stunningly accurate. In 2018, researchers reported significant deterioration aboard Erebus, caused by storm surges and buoyancy forces. Canada, the UK, and Inuit representatives formalized an agreement. All future artifacts, except for the first 65 retrieved, would be jointly owned by Canada and Inuit heritage agencies. Archaeologists now return each summer, braving tight weather windows to recover tools, boots, journals, even fragments of DNA. Remote-operated vehicles inside Terror revealed the ship hadn't anchored before sinking. Its cables were still neatly stowed. Modern analysis now does more than search. It interprets, recontextualizes, and rewrites. A 2013 study cast doubt on the lead poisoning theory. Bone samples showed lifetime exposure, not an acute spike. A later investigation suggested zinc deficiency and tuberculosis, not lead, may have collapsed immune systems. DNA testing added the human thread. In 2021, Warrant Officer John Gregory was identified from remains recovered in 1993, matched to a South African descendant. In 2024, Captain James Fitzjames was confirmed through a fragment of jawbone bearing its own cut marks from post-mortem defleshing. The mystery has not vanished, but it has evolved. The focus now is not just on discovery, but on remembrance and responsibility. Indigenous voices, long sidelined, are now central. Inuit oral tradition is no longer treated as anecdote, it is archival. Side by side, archaeology and memory work to thaw the silence left behind by 129 vanished souls. Thank you so much for sticking around until the end of the video. If you found the story of Sir Franklin's lost expedition interesting and want to explore other historical people, places, and events, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. It really helps out the channel. Our next video explores Swissair Flight 111, a passenger jet that went down off the coast of Nova Scotia in 1998 and claimed the lives of all 229 passengers and crew. This is a viewer-suggested video, so make sure you drop a comment below on what events you'd like to see covered. I'm working to build a community around these videos, and your thoughts on potential topics or ways to improve the channel are more than welcome. Your support makes this channel possible, and I'm excited to keep sharing these incredible stories with you.